Hello there, everybody. How are you? Hey, Greg. Hi, Russ. Have I read the book Winners Take All by Anand G? Yeah, I have a problem pronouncing his name too. No, I have not yet read his book. Have you read it, Russell? Do you like it? Is it good? Or is there a lot wrong with it? Randy Hedgebeth says, here. Hi, Randy. And Evelina Punt says, hola. Hola to you, Evelina. And Lana Dell and Greg have joined. Lana says, happy Monday. Yeah, happy Monday to you, Lana. Hope you have a better week this week and not working late on Saturday night. In what way, Russ? And Russ says, yes, it was eye opening. And Teresa Sanders says, I've been calling for Bernie. It takes about 15 minutes for my nerves to settle down. Telemarketers have caused people to just automatically hang up. Yes, I know. In fact, I almost always automatically hang up myself. Gee, it's really tough. And Greg says, Mayon Gabi. That must be Filipino for something. And it says, thanks. Overtime abounds. I guess it's good if you get paid for it. It can be good anyway. And Russ says, I'm sure you'll do more than one show from the content. Oh, you mean I'll be able to criticize and criticize and criticize, critique. Okay, tonight I want to talk about challenges to neoliberalism and what the Russia frenzy has meant for our politics, and also what a new administration, even if it's a progressive administration, is going to have to do to cope with the Supreme Court, to cope with the hostility of the Supreme Court to legislation by progressives. That means good evening in Ilonggo, one of the many languages in the Philippines. So you were right. And Russ Goman says that Anand G really shows a lot about the Clintons' neoliberalism. I mean, he exhibits a lot of the neoliberalism of the Clintons. That's question mark. And Joanne Olenhouse, Ricardio has joined, and Bonnie has joined, along with Jeff Ginter. Hi, Jeff. Hi, honey. I'm glad you've joined. Okay, on to neoliberalism. Then I say on to it. Let's see if it's here. Oh, by the way, tonight I'm here for New Macro Media. This, of course, is the in-depth show. And this tells me to sign up for my daily digest. But I'm trying to click it off in the wrong window. This is Popular Resistance. okay, .org. And Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers have an article about revolts against the neoliberal world, and this was done on October 27th, which is yesterday. And they're talking about the protests against the U.S. and big finance imposed neoliberal capitalism, and that they've exploded across the globe. And you remember, I reviewed an article by them 2 weeks ago called Pink Tide Against U.S. Domination Rising Again in Latin America. And then they reviewed 12 of the Latin American nations rising up against the privatization, cutting of social programs, soaring prices, and low wages. In the last week, there were mass protests in Chile and Bolivia. And Lebanon has widespread protests against debt and austerity measures. Okay, the non-aligned movement, which is critical of the use of illegal and unilateral coercive measures by the United States to force countries to bend to its will, is meeting in Azerbaijan. They say a central part of the recent rise of the pink tide was the mass protests in Ecuador led by indigenous peoples and the labor movement. And they point out this forced Lenin Moreno to repeal a package of laws that were demanded by the IMF this week after he arrested some of the leaders of the movement. Talks broke off, and then on Thursday, the indigenous movement convened to form a popular parliament to develop a new economic plan to avoid detrimental changes required by the IMF. The future in Ecuador is uncertain, but the people are not backing down. And you see the picture there of the huge crowd. But this is a huge crowd in Chile, not in Ecuador. There are probably some huge crowds there too. But this, I believe, is a crowd in Santiago. Yes, this Friday, more than 1 million people took to the streets in the Chilean capital of Santiago, uniting in a call against extreme neoliberal capitalism. The capital was brought to a standstill after a week of widespread protests met by a heavy police and military force. 16 people have died, over 200 were wounded, and over 1,500 detained, including children. Now catch this. The protests began on October 14th. High school students demonstrated against the rise in transit fares from the equivalent of U.S. dollars $1.12 to USD $1.16. A 4-cent rise triggered demonstrations, protests. That's sort of a last straw thing, isn't it? The protests grew to the point of shutting down all 136 stations of the Santiago metro system. That's a huge metro, 136 stations. 70 stations were damaged and 20 were set on fire. The protests progressed into a nationwide uprising against the government and its unfair neoliberal policies. The metro fare was just the last straw in a long list of grievances against a system that has robbed working class and middle class people of a decent and dignified life. The government declared a state of emergency, and the first time since Pinochet, the general who was the dictator in Chile for a good part of the 70s and most of the 80s, until there was an uprising against him, I believe in 1988 or 89, which led to the restoration of democracy in Chile. It's been actually for quite a number of years very prosperous and very democratic also. Uh, anyway, the government ordered the military with tanks and armored vehicles to patrol the streets. By Saturday, October 19th, the President Piñera went on television and said, quote, "I have heard the voice of my compatriots," unquote. He suspended the fare increase and announced he would host a roundtable to discuss the issues. He said, quote, "The people will be heard, but the protests have to stop," unquote. This has not deterred the people from continuing to protest. In a Sunday night address to the nation, Piñera declared, quote, "We are at war with a powerful enemy which is prepared to use violence without limit," unquote. Then it was the 11,000 soldiers and the Carabiniero police who rampaged across Chile, firing live rounds at demonstrators and dragging protesters out of their homes at night. The president's harsh response only aggravated the situation. Curfews were defied by thousands of demonstrators, and in Santiago, protesters holding pictures of victims under the Pinochet dictatorship temporarily surrounded the tanks. Chilean journalist Paul Walder describes how, quote, "a country that had seemed orderly and submissive last weekend has exploded with anger, rage accumulated by generations, passed on to teenagers as a decantation of the frustrations of their parents, siblings, and grandparents," unquote. It's a decantation of the fine wine of frustrations. And the uprising and brutal conflict with the police and the military is a reflection of, quote, "social pain accumulated through the long history of Chilean but neoliberalism. The people of Chile have been subjected to economic and political violence by the state. Salaries are low and taxes on workers are high, while billions of dollars have been stolen by corporations." Sound familiar? WSWS reported the uprising has expanded to involve workers writing, quote, "Dock workers marched en masse through several cities, stopping the bulk of national exports and closing 20 ports as a part of a national strike. Donning yellow vests worn for work, the sea of thousands of dock workers resembled France's yellow vests as they marched through the cities of Concepcion, Antofagasta, and San Antonio," unquote. Further, copper mines, a historically militant section of the Chilean workers, copper miners, I should say, who produced the country's primary export, announced a national strike. It's never covered in our media, is it? Beginning Wednesday, video showed copper miners on lunch break banging plates and silverware and chanting, quote, "General strike," unquote. The uprising includes trade unions and student, feminist, and environmentalist groups. They're calling for a reversal of neoliberal capitalism and a new government. Their demands are, quote, "transversal," unquote, non-sectoral, and include, quote, calling for Piñera's resignation, pay rises and cheaper basic services, a 40-hour week, the restoration of union rights, and sectoral collective bargaining, nationalization of both public services and strategic energy sectors, student debt forgiveness, the annulment of the country's private sector pension fund, the cancellation of the odious free market water codes, quote unquote, signed into law by Pinochet in 1981. Surprises me they haven't gotten rid of that long before this. Also progressive tax reform and a new migration policy. Perhaps most dramatically, the demonstrators are calling for a new constitution to be drafted by the Constituent Assembly, unquote. The Washington Post referred to the specter of a, quote, "Latin American spring," similar to the revolutions that shook North Africa and the Middle East in 2011. Stratfor, which is a notable and maybe an infamous intelligence organization, private intelligence organization, is quoted. With regional economies squeezed by sluggish growth and governments still seeking to implement painful pro-market reforms, the situation is ripe for disruptive, widespread unrest. The uprising in Chile is significant because prior to these protests, it was described as a success of capitalism. Chile is the original and perpetual laboratory for neoliberalism. With more than 40 years of economic shock policies and a steady, low-intensity war waged against the nation's working classes. Capitalists are shocked. Brian Winters, Vice President for Policy at the Americas Society/Council of the Americas, said, quote, everyone following Latin America is watching this and saying, quote, oh my God, Chile too, unquote. And there's a picture of a Bolivian protester showing support for Evo Morales outside the presidential palace in La Paz, Bolivia, on October 20th, 2019. And you should be able to see that, but pretty well. It says Evo Pueblo Futuro Seguro. I'm not entirely sure how to translate that. Some of you may have much better Spanish than I do. Mine is almost nil. So in Bolivia, Morales won re-election in the first round of voting. He is, of course, the leader of Movement to Socialism, the MAS party. He gained 47.07% of the vote, enough to put him 10 percentage points above his closest rival, Carlos Mesa, who received 36.51% of votes. So Bolivia does not require a second round of voting if the top candidate achieves over 40% of the vote with a 10-point margin over the second-place finisher. This is the fourth time Evo Morales has won the presidency in the first round of voting. Before the results, the opposition announced it would mount a coup if Evo won re-election. After the result, his rival Mesa called for essentially riots in the streets, mobilizations in the streets that ended in violence at vote counting stations, with some opposition protesters burning ballots and the buildings where counting was taking place. Though Mesa had originally endorsed the results when they temporarily showed him having a slightly larger vote share, but he refused to recognize the results after they indicated that Evo Morales had won a first-round victory. Quote, a coup is underway carried out by the right wing with foreign support. What are the methods of this coup attempt? They're not recognizing or waiting for election results. They're burning down election courts. They want to proclaim the second-place candidate is the winner. Evo Morales said to journalists. Social movements organized to defend the election against the attempted violent coup. The movements declared a state of emergency and called for mobilizations in the streets to defend democracy, while right-wing protesters launched numerous violent attacks across the country. The right-wing rioters blocked election materials from being delivered for the vote, resulting in the count being suspended. Labor organizers joined the defense of democracy, denouncing, quote, the oligarchic and privatizing interests that hide behind these violent actions. The Organization of American States inflamed the opposition by questioning the results. The Center for Policy and Economic Research responded to the points raised by the OAS. The last is an American think tank, which is based here in Washington, raised by the OAS, and urged them to retract their statements. Also, Bolivia responded by inviting the OAS to carry out an audit of the final vote count. Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, accepted the invitation to initiate an analysis of electoral integrity. International observers in La Paz who were monitoring the general elections, however, praised the legitimacy and transparency of the process, which contrasts with statements made by opposition leaders. The non-aligned movement, the picture you see is a picture of those attending the foreign affairs, the ministerial conference for the countries of the non-aligned movement in Baku, Azerbaijan, in October 2019. And the non-aligned movement unites against the unilateral coercive measures of the United States. So the non-aligned movement, that's us. The non-aligned movement is meeting in Azerbaijan this week. At the meeting, Venezuela's president, Nicolas Maduro, criticized the IMF and denounced the U.S. economic and financial aggressions for being as lethal as its armies. He criticized IMF, neoliberal austerity and privatization policies, an attack on the most vulnerable and a violation of human rights. He described the unilateral coercive measures of the United States as a violation of international law, aimed at pressuring people to support by U.S. Neoliberalism by inflicting collective punishment against the people as blackmail. The NAM was established in 1961 as a forum for independent dialogue and cooperation among 120 developing countries that sought to ensure national independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of non-aligned countries. It represents 55% of the world's population. They oppose imperialism, colonialism, neocolonialism, racism, and all forms of foreign aggression, occupation, domination, interference, or hegemony. This July, NAM held a meeting in Caracas that supported Venezuela and opposed the economic war by the United States. They released the Caracas Political Declaration. The rising tide in Latin America and around the world is reflected in the NAM. Popular resistance is working with organizations and activists around the world to create a worldwide network that will work together to oppose the lawless actions of the United States and any country that acts similarly, such as interference in the politics of other countries, through open and covert regime change operations, the imposition of unilateral coercive economic measures, or the threat of militarism. And then there's a link that you can click to sign on to the Global Appeal for Peace here. And then the article ends. People in the United States suffer similar conditions to those around the world who are plagued by neoliberalism. As the Arab Spring inspired the Occupy movement, will this anti-neoliberal autumn rekindle mass protests in the United States? This is something we need to ponder and perhaps to prepare for and organize to make it happen. So say Kevin Zeese and Margaret Flowers, the two partners behind Popular Resistance .org and many protests and demonstrations here in the United States now over a long period of time. They've been doing great work for 10 years or so now. Okay, you can see that there are protests and resistances and disturbances around the world, in Latin America, but in Asia too, and people are rising against the regimes, okay, of neoliberalism. Uh, how long it's possible for neoliberalism to hold sway, I don't know. But there are resistances that are significant all over. And it remains to be seen what kind of power they can muster uh, in opposing the financial forces, okay, of neoliberalism that in many cases have a stranglehold around the finances and the banks, okay, of their countries, and that doesn't even consider the military capabilities and force of the United States. I personally think for most of these nations, the financial power of the United States is actually more important, okay, than its military power. In the end, though, it is backed by our military power. And as we keep on getting involved in these wars, okay, the regime change wars, we do so in tandem with the use, okay, of our economic power to try to bring other nations around the world to heel. This has to stop, okay, at some point. I don't know when, but we have to move aggressively against it uh, ourselves. We can hope that the Bernie Sanders movement, if it is successful this time, will lead to foreign policies which will end this reign, okay, of economic terror, okay, and military terror, okay, on just a large swath of countries throughout the world. We can hope for that. We have to work, okay, to make it happen. So, next, there is the frenzy about Russia. You should have that on the screen I'm sharing now. Yes, you do. The article is entitled "The Frenzy About Russia Has Undermined Our Progressive Agendas." And the article was written by Norman Solomon, a Truthout, who, by the way, is a major advisor to Bernie Sanders in the campaign. Let's go to clearly get rid of most of the extraneous matter. There's a picture of Putin and Trump. Uh, so this starts off with a statement that when Trump actually won the presidency, there were lots of crucial questions that begged to be addressed, like how could it happen? Was Hillary Clinton seen by voters as too close to Wall Street, too aligned with wealthy elites? Was Bernie Sanders correct that loyalty to the billionaire class would undermine the Democratic ticket's appeal to working class voters? Those were hardly the kinds of questions Democratic Party leaders and corporate media wanted to put in the national spotlight. Instead, they quickly shifted the focus to Russia. And Norman Solomon actually reviews the story. Within 24 years of Clinton's concession speech, campaign manager Robbie Mook and campaign chair John Podesta assembled a communications team at the national headquarters in Brooklyn to engineer the case that the election wasn't entirely on the up and up. And of course, we all know they went crazy for a couple hours. They went over the script they would pitch to the press and the public. Already, Russian hacking was the centerpiece of the argument. Salman says there were real Russian efforts to intervene in the election, but their scope and effects became widely exaggerated in U.S. media and politics. A laser focus on Russia quickly substituted for examining basic reasons for Hillary Clinton's loss. The traumatic reality of Trump's victory called for a serious and well-grounded exploration of the key factors that led to the catastrophe. But did we get that, folks? No, we didn't get that. We might have critically assessed the abandonment by the Democrats of many working-class voters, and we might have considered what Chuck Schumer did in planning in July of 2016. He's, quote, every blue-collar Democrat we lose in Western Pennsylvania will pick up two moderate Republicans in the suburbs in Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin. What a dreamer. What a dreamer. The elitism of centrist democratic orthodoxy, having no use for such ideas as Medicare for all and tuition-free public college, failed to ignite enthusiasm or inspire turnout from the working class. But instead of scrutinizing the political approach they were taking, what came to the fore was a fixation on relentlessly blaming Vladimir Putin. It was a fixation that let the party's leadership off the hook, which, of course, is why they did that. So, just a comment, the Democratic Party for a very long time has been doing that kind of thing. When they fail, they take attention away from their own failures and they try to blame something else. Now, I don't know whether that began to take place in the 1970s or when it began to take place, in the 1980s. But by the time of the Clinton leadership of the party in the 1990s, Clinton's failure to pass a health insurance reform was attributed not to the complex plan that Hillary Clinton put forward, but was attributed to the idea that what the Clintons tried to do was to introduce a plan of their own into the Congress, and this was a lesson then learned by the Democratic Party. And when Obama came into office with so many Clinton advisors on his team, at the end, those advisors told him, well, the lesson we learned during the Clinton administration was that it's a mistake for the executive to introduce one of their bills into Congress because it will provide a target for the insurance companies and it will be too difficult, to defeat them. So what we need to do is to let Congress hammer out a bill with the insurance companies as part of the process. And then maybe we can get a bill through. And so they got the Affordable Care Act through using that particular strategy, and you know what a disaster was. It ended the possibilities of the Democrats getting anything else of significance through for the rest of the two administrations of Barack Obama. Nothing else could be done because the reaction to the Affordable Care Act basically created a paralysis, which the Republicans made use of to sweep into office at the end of 2010, and then to basically block everything else of major significance for the rest of the time that Obama was the president. So they learned how to look for excuses all the time and to focus attention on their excuses as major issues. and never to grapple with the real problems that we as a society face. And they did it again in 2016 with the help of the national media, and we've been distracted now since the election of 2016 with Russia, Russia, Russia. And we haven't been paying attention to our knitting as a nation. The Democrats and the Republicans have succeeded in diverting us to a whole range of issues so that the real issues facing us do not get discussed. Anyway, Solomon continues. The DNC went into 2017 with a grand total of one full-time staffer to address the nation's rampant suppression of voting rights. Why did they do that? Well, they had exhausted their capital with the grassroots. They couldn't raise any money from the grassroots. They weren't trying to raise any money from the grassroots anyway. They were trying to raise money from the rich. And after the election was over, the rich didn't give them any money. They'd given all the money to Hillary Clinton, which she simply wasted, of course, during that extremely lavish campaign. She spent twice as much as Trump, and you see the results that she produced. In the spring, the DNC trumpeted expansion of that staffing to 4 employees. Oh, congratulations. They should have had 400 employees. There was a clear need for legal resources to challenge pernicious voter ID laws and other barriers that had blocked so many people of color from casting their ballots in 2016. Yet in April of 2018, when the DNC filed a lawsuit, it was against the Russian government, as well as the Trump campaign and associates, and WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange. From the outset of his presidency, Trump had been guilty of flagrantly violating the Constitution's Foreign and Domestic Emoluments Clause, which prohibit a president from gaining any personal benefits from government action. That rather than zero in on the impeachable offenses involving corrupt self-dealing, which are easy for voters to understand, I agree with him, they're easy to understand. The emolument stuff is easy to understand. The abuse of power in relation to seeking to gain wealth from foreign governments, easy to understand. Instead of doing this, corporate media and leading Democrats, Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, hello, focus narrowly on Russia. Rachel Maddow, too, of course. As the Trump administration proceeded to inflict a vast array of harm, the Democratic leadership in Congress and liberal media stars like Rachel Maddow on Comcast-owned MSNBC persisted with a Russia obsession that would last years. That obsession crowded out attention to an enormous range of moral atrocities being inflicted by the Trump regime, including economic violence against low-income people in the United States and U.S.-aided slaughter by Saudi Arabia in Yemen. A study by the media watchdog group FAIR found that MSNBC, the leading liberal cable network, they self-style themselves, that did not run a single segment devoted specifically to Yemen in the second half of 2017. Wacko, right? Absolutely crazy. And in these latter roughly 6 months of the year, MSNBC ran nearly 5,000% more segments that mentioned Russia than segments that mentioned Yemen, unquote. FAIR documented that in 2017, the first full year of MSNBC's ongoing Russiagate obsession. The network only aired one broadcast on the U.S.-backed Saudi airstrikes that have killed thousands of Yemeni civilians, and it never mentioned the impoverished nation's colossal cholera epidemic, which infected more than 1 million Yemenis in the largest outbreak in recorded history, unquote. Notwithstanding such realities, the mass media continued to fixate on Russia, while homegrown assaults on Trump became ever more vicious and damaging. While homegrown assaults on democracy became ever more vicious and damaging across the United States. The fact that the Trump team lied about contacts with Russians caused people to lose sight of the fact that Trump continually lied about almost everything under the sun: improper business deals and corrupt entanglements of the Trump organization had been occurring in many countries, and Russia-related news coverage continued to mightily distract all too many progressives from anti-democratic maneuvers that were underway in our country. This year, the Transformative Justice Coalition released a list of 61 forms of voter suppression, quote unquote, that have taken hold in the United States, denying basic voting rights due to race, ethnicity, income, and age, insidiously preventing millions of people from exercising their rights to vote. How many of those 61 forms of voter suppression did Russia have something to do with? Zero. The dynamics of the Russia obsession have fit a classic pattern in U.S. history: avoiding and distracting from key domestic failures by blaming a foreign power. In a country rife with systemic and severe shortfalls of democracy, leading Democrats and corporate media were all too pleased to concentrate their rhetorical fire on a faraway adversary. Why blame Wall Street when you can blame the Kremlin? Why examine the power of American oligarchs when you can avoid mentioning they exist while denouncing Russian oligarchs? For progressive agendas, the fueling of hostility towards Russia has been unproductive and damaging. Overall, tremendous amounts of time, energy, and resources have been squandered on Russiagate-related articles and messaging, while a huge spectrum of crucial issues got short shrift. Such dynamics weaken capacities to develop programs and outreach that could appeal to the most deeply felt concerns in communities around the United States. Meanwhile, prospects for true national security have diminished, with foreseeable and highly dangerous long-term consequences. Lost in all the torrid anti-Russia rhetoric of recent years was a simple necessity that President Lyndon Johnson, hardly a dove while in the midst of escalating the horrific Vietnam War, close parens, expressed at the time of his Glassboro summit with Alexei Kosygin in June of 1967. Standing next to the Soviet premier after more than a dozen hours of direct talks, Johnson said, quote, "We've made further progress in an effort to improve our understanding of each other's thinking on a number of questions," unquote. Then as now, the danger of nuclear holocaust made such understanding vital. But amid the frenzy over Russia, millions of self-identified democratic moderates, liberals, and progressives became fiercely uninterested in any steps to improve our understanding of Russian leaders' thinking. Merely advocating the ideas of talks with Putin or Russians became tantamount to heresy or being a Putin apologist. Even the most revered peace advocate in Congress got onto the bandwagon. Meanwhile, the military, by the way, that's a link to Barbara Lee right there. Meanwhile, the military-industrial complex has profited greatly from growing antagonism towards Russia, coupled with contempt for diplomacy that has helped to rationalize steep increases in the military budget proposed by Trump and cheered on by House and Senate Democratic leaders. During federal budget negotiations in 2018, with Trump requesting a staggering 11% Pentagon budget increase over 2 years, Nancy Pelosi boasted in an email to House Democrats, quote, "In our negotiations, congressional Democrats have been fighting for increases in funding for defense," unquote. The office of Senate Democratic leader Schumer declared, quote, "We fully support President Trump's Defense Department requests," unquote. Months later, an overwhelming majority of House and Senate Democrats supported The massive 2019 National Defense Authorization Act of $717 billion. I think the appropriations bill was even higher than that, if I recall correctly. I thought that one hit $750 billion. Remember, it's the appropriations bill that counts, that actually delivers the money. During the last 3 years, a resurgent atmosphere of Cold War conformity has stigmatized important historic facts, whether about U.S. interference in Russian politics or the dangerous expansion of NATO, which violated an explicit pledge from the George H.W. Bush administration in 1990 that NATO would not expand, quote, 1 inch eastward, unquote. Famous last words. That's like, no new, read my lips, no new taxes, right? Wider and wider arrays of inconvenient facts are apt to be tarred as Russia-style disinformation. This has all been good for the ratings of media stars like Maddow, and good for a pocketbook too, and the profiles of politicians like Democratic Representative Adam Schiff. But the effects have badly damaged the potential for achieving practical and essential measures, such as arms control treaties between the world's two nuclear powers, and the enormous pressure on Trump to prove he isn't a Putin flunky after all ended up encouraging such perilous moves as U.S. withdrawal from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. That treaty was negotiated, by the way, after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the United States in the early 1960s. That's how far back it goes. It was a 50-year-old treaty. Quote, tensions are festering between two nations with large quantities of nuclear weapons on virtual hair-trigger alert, yet the current partisan fixations in Washington are ignoring the dangers to global stability and ultimately to human survival, unquote. An open letter published by The Nation pointed out last year. The letter which I signed, that is Norman Solomon signed it, added, quote, no political advantage, real or imagined, could possibly compensate for the consequences if even a fraction of U.S. and Russian arsenals were to be utilized in a thermonuclear exchange. The tacit pretense that the worsening of U.S. and Russian relations does not worsen the odds of survival for the next generation is profoundly false, unquote. So, it's comforting, I think, to find that Norman Solomon is high up in the Sanders campaign and will very likely be moving into government in some capacity if Sanders is elected. It's nice to know that someone who thinks about foreign policy in this type of framework will have a voice in the new administration. I think it's almost certain that he will, because he's a very trusted advisor, okay, of Bernie's. Now, on this is completely right, of course. This is what's happened. I mean, the Democratic Party has blown it again. Now, we may luck out, but as they're proceeding on the impeachment road and trying to keep it narrowly focused on the incident in the Ukraine, we are in a bad way. They are doing everything they can to protect Joe Biden and even possibly Nancy Pelosi, because there's some words around that maybe she was involved in the goings-on, okay, in the Ukraine. They're avoiding all of the other issues that are appropriate for impeaching Trump and a much more important grounds than the attempted interference with the current elections, okay, and primaries. Look at all the people who have been killed by Trump. Look at all the suffering as a result of the foreign policy of Trump. Look at the rationale behind the foreign policy. Apparently, in most cases, there's something in the rationale which connects up to gains that Trump will personally make through the foreign policy moves that he is making. I think the Democrats should be impeaching, and they should be impeaching hard. But they need to understand that they must impeach Trump based on grounds that will not cause the American people to shrug their collective shoulders. That cannot be what we impeach Trump about, okay, or over. That is not going to work. Not going to work at all. And let's hope that the frenzy over Russia has now ended. And let's hope that we're not now entering just a frenzy over Ukraine. It's got to be bigger than that. If there's going to be a frenzy, it had better be about the major crimes that Trump has committed during his time in office. We've got to work to make that work, to bring those crimes front and center so Pelosi and Schumer and the Democrats cannot ignore them. Okay, the last thing I want to cover is the problem of the Supreme Court and what to do about it. Justin Slaughter wrote an article for the American Prospect entitled How Democrats Can Insulate New Laws from a Hostile Supreme Court. And the brief statement at the beginning says the conservative Roberts Court has become increasingly aggressive in attacking Democratic laws and policies. It's time for Democrats to counterattack. It'll be interesting to see what Justin Slaughter considers a counterattack. This was written on October 22nd, by the way. So it's been hanging fire for a few days. I haven't had a chance to get to it. But I thought sooner or later I had to. So, oh, by the way, share, like, and subscribe when this goes up, okay, on YouTube. And please become a patron at www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. I'd certainly appreciate it if you would become patrons. So, okay, getting back to the issue of what we're going to do about the Supreme Court. Justin starts off by saying it's a tough time to be a Democrat, on top of fears about the state of health care, anger at treatment of children at the border, growing anxiety about foreign interference in our elections, and the dread that accompanies the words Donald Trump's second term, unquote. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy's retirement represented one final sucker punch. Facing the first full term with Brett Kavanaugh, a full-throated conservative on the Supreme Court, Democrats are despairing Indeed, there are some whispered fears that the next Democratic administration may have already failed with the 5-4 Republican-appointed court able to both strike down any newly passed progressive statutes while also by ripping away all notable laws and rules from the last 80 years, foreclosing even the possibility of government action to protect the weak from the powerful. Yet there are steps that Democrats can and should take to mitigate the damage that the new, very conservative Supreme Court can do to democratic laws and policies. And it won't take threatening to pack the court either. Well, to that, I have to say, screw threatening to pack the court. If the Democrats get control of the presidency, the Senate, and the House, one of the first things they should do is pack the court. Pack the court. And if they cannot pack the court and give Sanders 6 more nominees quickly, what they need to do then, in fact, maybe they need to do this also with respect to certain laws, they should use Article 3, Section 2 in order to prevent those laws from getting reviewed by the Supreme Court. The Medicare for All legislation, in particular, should be protected in that way, if need be. In addition, the Green New Deal, which is a matter of all our survivals, needs to be protected in that way as well. It's within the authority of Congress, according to the Constitution, to do that. It's time for Democrats to do what is necessary to heal the mess that they can't completely blame on the Republicans because they had a hand in making that mess also. Most importantly, Democrats will need to start assuming, I'm going on with the article now, greater judicial hostility to the laws they write than they have in the past and begin to draft them to preemptively survive harsh judicial scrutiny. And what better way to do that than to pack the court and use Article 3, Section 2? Writing laws with the explicit goal of shielding them from a hostile judicial eye has not been a priority to this point. I couldn't agree more. Famously, when Nancy Pelosi was asked about whether the ACA was at risk of judicial challenge in winter 2009, her response was, "Are you serious?" ? Starting from the premise that any major law will face serious challenge for years is the first step to protecting new laws. Yes, and the second step is packing the court. And the third step is using Article 3, Section 2. Second, Democrats have to use the tools available to them during the drafting process to protect their laws against judicial overreach. The tools available to them include the tool of packing the court and the tool of using Article 3, Section 2, the exceptions clause. The easiest tool, he didn't say that, I did, of course. The easiest tool is to make their new laws fully severable so that a flaw in one piece of a law will only result in that piece being struck down rather than the whole law. While the Dodd-Frank Act did contain a severability clause, amazingly, the Affordable Care Act did not, which almost sunk it in litigation. Routinely adding severability will necessitate the end of what we might call load-bearing policies, quote-unquote, concepts that everything else in a law depends upon to work, such as the individual mandate in the Affordable Care Act. Instead, redundant structures will become important to laws. It has been argued that the reason for the absence of a severability clause was that the Senate bill was expected to be revised in conference between the House and Senate, and Scott Brown's Senate victory made holding a conference impossible. But Justin says, this is exactly the point. Dems should have severability clauses in all bills from the start. I agree. Third, Democrats need to stop shying away from calling things taxes. Part of what almost took down the ACA is that the mandate was alleged to be not a tax, but a regulation of commerce under Article 1's Commerce Clause. Ultimately, John Roberts asserted that the mandate was a tax, saving the law. Thank you, John Roberts. Maybe he can be brought to save some more laws. But maybe he doesn't have to save them if the Democrats would stop calling everything, would stop shying away from calling things taxes, and moreover, would have severability clauses. I agree. These are important. Democrats didn't want to be accused of raising taxes, but they were anyway. The new, more progressive Democratic Party seems to have less anxiety about creating a new tax. Yeah, Bernie's all about new tax, if it can ensure that the vast majority of Americans end up saving money overall. Yeah, that's the bottom line. Can the taxes save money overall? Or can you do the taxes so they hit only a few, and that the benefits that you associate with those taxes are spread out as widely as possible among the people? Fourth, look for Democrats to push for legislation to take effect faster, okay, to create the benefits, okay, that are immediate. And he says judges are people like everyone else. They're influenced by both theory and real-world consequences. It's easier to wipe away a law because of an arguable legal flaw when the law hasn't yet taken effect, rather than after it has already changed people's lives. He's right. And remember, the Affordable Care Act did not go into full effect until 2014. Not until then. So it had hardly benefited people until 2014. But the silly Democrats provided for taxation to support the law from 2011 on. So for 2011, 2012, and 2013, people were paying taxes for supporting the Affordable Care Act, and they weren't getting any benefits. Jesus. Can't believe Nancy Pelosi did such a stupid thing. She's considered such a smart person, such a savvy political person. This is what she did with the Affordable Care Act. It was her plan to get a deficit neutral piece of legislation. And the way she did that is by levying taxes for 3 years before the major benefits could be realized by people. Fifth, Democrats should consider writing a provision in all major pieces of legislation requiring any judicial challenges be fast-tracked in the Supreme Court, possibly by ordering that challenges be made in a specific federal court of appeals under an expedited schedule. If the court can rule on a law quickly, that ups the odds that the same Congress can fix any defect before they lose a majority in either body. This is a good suggestion, but I still think some laws should have an Article 3, Section 2 exceptions clause in them, so the court can't rule on the law at all. Maybe other laws not quite so important to the survival of people or the survival of us all. Okay, maybe those laws can tolerate some judicial interference from time to time, okay, and therefore should only be fast-tracked, okay, to the Supreme Court. But we really have to reduce the power of the Supreme Court to block the legislation that is needed in the middle of the most dire crisis that our country has ever faced, specifically of the climate emergency. Sixth, Congress probably has to rely less on rulemakings. So what are those? For 4 decades now, Congress has increasingly enacted policy via requiring agencies with expertise on specific matters to issue rules. As the Supreme Court increasingly seems skeptical of deferring to executive branch agencies, this arrangement is coming to an end, leaving Congress with little choice but to make detailed policy calls itself. In other words, Congress has been vaguely enacting these laws, leaving the details to the executive branch to codify into the laws that really govern people. One area in which they did this, and this goes back for quite a long way, was in the area of tax law, where companies could file to be 501c3s, which are not supposed to be doing any political stuff, okay, at all. But rules were made by the Eisenhower administration, in the Eisenhower administration, and by succeeding administrations, in which it was okay for the 501c3s to do political things as long as more than 50% of their activities were not overtly political. So you got all kinds of conservative think tanks, which are political as hell, doing things to mold public opinion in a highly political and highly conservative way over the years, and still retaining their tax exemptions because of rules made by executive branch agencies. That's one good example of that. Justin goes on, that is a vexing task given the slow loss of expertise and funding of congressional committees and resources on Capitol Hill, but it can be improved by increasing the resources and staffing of Hill offices and restoring entities like the Office of Technology Assessment. Boy, is that needed, which then Speaker Newt Gingrich closed in 1995. That was, from Gingrich's point of view, okay, it wasn't a big mistake, but it was a big mistake, a very big mistake for Democrats to allow that to happen. And when they regain control of Congress again, not to immediately restore the OTA. That is an office that is sorely needed. These ideas are not a panacea. In the short term, the gridlock in the legislature could force the next Democratic president to rely more on rulemaking, making progress with existing laws already passed by Congress. And for the immediate future, Democrats have to accept that the court will be a harsh judge of their laws and policies from now on, and their rulemaking also, and adapt to that new reality. Frankly, it's long overdue. The court has asserted its authority brazenly for some time. It sure has. I mean, brazenly. In the 90s, okay, it did that. At the turn of the century, it determined, illegitimately, in my view, who would be the president of the United States. It selected the president of the United States by a 5-4 majority controlled by the Republicans. It was a political decision. And it got George Bush into office and paved the way for a war criminal, unconvicted war criminal, but nevertheless a war criminal, to cause the death of so many hundreds of thousands of people over a period of time. Ridiculous. In the end, Democrats, says Justin, have to recommit to the practicing of politics. So you worried about the court? The best advice I can give is to go and volunteer some time knocking doors this fall. Phone your senators about the court and take some action. Ultimately, it all comes back to the ballot box. It does if the ballot box isn't fixed. We have no idea this time how badly the ballot box will be fixed. We do know that they're going to make very serious attempts, though, to fix it. Increasingly, they've been serious about this, and increasingly, they have been successful in doing this, in suppressing the votes, and in creating situations that suppress the votes. So, let me see how you're doing now. Go back to Facebook, see what you've been saying. Jim Rushford has joined. Russ says he's got to call it a night. And Teresa Sanders says, I kind of agree. It just seems like more distraction. Let me get back. And Bonnie said hi. Gigi Schaumburg has joined, and Dolores Pierce has joined. Hi, Dolores and Gigi. Sandy Degg has joined. Hey, Sandy, how are you? And Steve Wolfbrand said hi, Dr. Joe, and also Dion Adams has joined. Okay, and Evelina Punt says, for a secure future vote for AVO. Ah, thank you, Evelina. Thank you. It's good to know that. I thought it might have something to do with security. Okay, and Evelina says, more amiable foreign policy will also depend on Corbyn's making it the prime minister, especially in the southern cone, especially Argentina, in Uruguay, and Chile. Yeah, the UK still has a lot of influence there, certainly, and the Conservatives certainly tend to be aggressive in that particular section of the world. It looks like there's going to be an election there soon. And right now, it doesn't look like the Labour has very much control. I hope that Corbyn can pull this one out of the fire, but I don't see how he's going to do it unless he runs a campaign of blistering attacks on the Conservatives featuring MMT. He has to take MMT out of the box, and he has to run an anti-austerity campaign. He can't just focus on Brexit. He can't just focus on Brexit because his mind, the mind of Labour, is divided on Brexit. If they focus only on that and make that the only issue of the campaign, I think they're going to lose. They have to run this campaign on something else. And that's what I think. As hard as it's going to be, they have to go to the way the Tories have been ruining the UK over a long period of time now. Steve says the military-industrial complex, the MIC, out of control. Steve says support Tulsi to end endless war. I usually do support Tulsi, but I have to say that I need an explanation for her recent visit to Wall Street to talk to funders. I know she's desperate, but I can't agree to her being bought. I just can't agree to her being bought. That's it. I can't agree to that. Steve says, I respectfully disagree. Impeachment is a waste of time that will not win the Senate. But better to get Bernie Sanders elected. Okay, I can't agree with that. I mean, I agree it's better to get Bernie Sanders elected, but I don't think it's an either or. I think we need both. But we have to impeach on the right grounds. The reason why we have to impeach is because we have to end this continuing moral hazard of just ignoring what the president actually does. We just create this continuing moral hazard that a president can do anything, and that the only punishment the president may face is at the polls, especially since the polls are not all that reliable right now with the voter suppression, okay, and all the manipulation, okay, that's going on. I mean, you're assuming that Bernie can win. I think he can win. I do. But I would also like to know that Trump is out of there, and I would also like to know that we, the American people, would have shown that a president cannot get away with anything that he wants to get away with, no matter how terrible it is. Teresa says, what you said about Article 3, Section 2 and packing the court needs to be a clip we can share. Well, can you help to make this clip? If you can, that would be very good. And Teresa says, I kind of agree. It just seems like more distraction. It is distraction. There's no question it's distraction. But there are some distractions that we have to respond to in a creative and constructive way. Because at its heart, this is not a distraction. Trump threatens us every day he is in office. We cannot tolerate his being in office any longer. We have to work as hard as we can in order to get him out of there. Thanks for coming, Russ. Russ says good night. Steve Wolfbrand says, yep. Sarah Liam said, I'm sick of hearing about Warren. People are falling for her Progressive Act. Yes, I don't think Warren is extremely progressive either. She is not what we need. She's also deceptive. I don't like that. She's waffling back and forth on things all the time. The Sanders campaign has begun to emphasize now, through Ocasio-Cortez, okay, and Rashida Tlaib, okay, and Ilhan Omar, they're all emphasizing Bernie is the person we can trust. Why are they for Bernie? Because Bernie is the person they can trust. Bernie is the person they know will follow through on what he promises. Steve Wolfbrand says, yeah, provisional ballots were never counted here in California in 2016. I know. And how about the 200,000 votes that were lost in Brooklyn, the headquarters of the Clinton campaign? Steve says, not true about Tulsi, Joe. Check on Nico's house about it. If you can put up a link to Nico's show, I'd be grateful. I was looking for Nico's answer to that charge. I'm talking about in the last few days, Steve. I'm not talking about the old charge. I'm talking about what happened in just the last a few days. If you have a link to a show Nico did about that, I'd be happy to watch it. I usually watch a lot of his stuff anyway. Steve says good night. And Teresa says, I wish I had the skills. So do I. But I can't do all the things that I do and video editing also. And need somebody who can do the video editing and also the production. And I think that's it. Any more comments, questions? Why don't you just restream your own clip and just do a 5-minute statement about it? That's a good suggestion. I might be able to do that. I'll check that out. See if it works. I mean, I got to put up the YouTube anyway. So all I have to do is find the clip. I also have a simple video editor that I might be able to use that I downloaded, made available, but I still have to learn to use. But I know it's simple, so I may be able to use it fairly easily. Steve says it's about the Wall Street thing 2 days ago. I don't know how to post links. Easy to find on YouTube. Okay, I'll look up Mikasa Sukasa and look for it. Okay, Evelina says very insightful as always. Thank you. Well, thank you for coming, Evelina. It's great to see you here. Any other comments or questions? Thank you for the hearts, folks. Thank you for the shares. Lana says, yes, a short and sweet video on that specific item would be very, very helpful. Insightful as always. Thank you. So, okay, I guess I'm going to end now. So have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow night. I'll be back with some good stuff tomorrow night. I promise. Steve says, thanks for another great show. It's like a college course without tuition. Well, thank you, Steve. I don't know that it's as organized as a college course, but okay. I used to be a college teacher, both in undergraduate and graduate school, so it's perhaps not surprising. Anyway, thanks a million for coming. I'll see you tomorrow.